Hello and welcome to another episode of the Halloween Podcast. I am your host, Lyle Perez, and you're listening to episode 9 of our special series, The Dark Record, where we uncover history's eeriest stories, one strange and unsettling case at a time. Tonight, we step into a story where the line between fact and fiction almost disappears. 14 years before the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic, a little-known author wrote about a massive luxury liner that suffered the very same fate. His fictional ship was called the Titan, and the uncanny parallels to the real tragedy have left people asking the same question for more than a century. Was it just coincidence or something more? The next entry into the dark record, the Titan Prediction. Let's begin. I first came across this story as a kid watching Beyond Belief, Fact or Fiction, one of my favorite shows growing up. That program specialized in tales that seemed too strange to be true, the kind of stories that made you stop and question whether the world really works the way we think it does. They would present you with a mystery, a bizarre coincidence, or an unexplainable event, and then challenge you to decide, was it fact? Or was it fiction? For me, no story from that series stuck quite as deeply as the one about the Titan. Because unlike so many of the legends they featured, this one could be traced back to an actual book, printed and published years before the Titanic ever left port. It wasn't just a folktale whispered over time, it was written down, dated, and available for anyone to read. That made it different and far more unsettling. The man behind the story was Morgan Robertson. He wasn't a mystic, a psychic, or even a particularly famous author. He was a working sailor who later turned to writing. Born in 1861, Robertson spent years as a merchant seaman, and during that time, he saw firsthand the dangers of the sea, unpredictable weather, the ever-present threat of ice, and the arrogance of men who believed new technology could conquer nature. He wasn't writing from imagination alone, he was drawing on hard experience. By the late 1890s, he had started publishing short nautical stories, many of which were serialized in magazines of the day. They were popular enough to earn him some attention, but nothing suggested that one of his tales would one day be seen as prophetic. In 1898, Robertson released a novella titled Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. On its surface, it was just another sea story, a cautionary tale about human pride, about the idea that no matter how advanced our machines become, nature still has the power to humble us. Readers at the time would have seen it as melodramatic fiction. The Titan was described as the largest ship ever built, a floating palace outfitted with every luxury but fatally lacking in safety. She carried too few lifeboats, her builders boasting that she was unsinkable. And then, in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, she met her doom. At the time, the novella caused little stir. It was just another tale of disaster at sea, joining a long tradition of maritime fiction. But history has a strange way of breathing new life into forgotten works. 14 years later, when the Titanic set sail, the details Robertson had imagined would suddenly take on a chilling new weight. Robertson's fictional Titan was not just a ship, it was a vision of excess, of how far human ambition could push against the sea. In his novella, he described her as 800 feet long, a staggering size for the late 19th century when most ocean liners were significantly smaller. She was built of the strongest steel, fitted with the most advanced engines, and capable of racing across the Atlantic at speeds that seemed unimaginable. Inside, she carried every comfort the wealthy could desire: lavish dining halls, smoking rooms, and staterooms that rivaled the grand hotels of London and New York. The Titan, Robertson wrote, was the pinnacle of human progress, a floating city that seemed untouchable. But woven into that triumph was a fatal flaw. Like many ships of her time, the Titan carried only a fraction of the lifeboat she would have needed to save everyone on board. Robertson made it clear in his story the builders saw lifeboats as a nuisance, as clutter that ruined the clean lines of the decks. Besides, they believed the Titan was unsinkable. What could possibly happen to a ship so large, so strong, so technologically advanced? It's that hubris, the arrogance of believing mankind had conquered the sea, that stands at the heart of Robertson's tale. He had spent enough years at sea to know the ocean doesn't bend to human pride. Icebergs didn't care how big a ship was. Storms didn't pause for reputation. And in his story, he created the ultimate test of that arrogance. The Titan sailed across the North Atlantic in April, pushing forward at nearly full speed. And then, in the dead of night, the inevitable happened. She struck an iceberg. The details Robertson included are haunting in hindsight. The iceberg collision occurs on the starboard side, tearing open the hull and flooding the compartment so quickly that the ship is doomed almost immediately. Panic breaks out among the passengers as the crew scrambles to load what few lifeboats are available. But there aren't enough. Hundreds are left stranded on deck as the icy waters rise. Within hours, the Great Titan slides beneath the waves, her passengers swallowed by the freezing Atlantic. When Futility was published, these details were simply part of the drama, the kind of writing that made for a good, cautionary sea tale. But later, readers would look back and realize how precisely Robertson's fiction lined up with the fate of another great ship. The Titan was meant as a symbol, a warning about pride. Yet it would become something more, a story that felt less like invention and more like a blueprint for disaster. 14 years after Robertson's novella was printed, another great liner prepared to cross the Atlantic. This one was not born of imagination, but of steel and rivets, a real marvel built in the shipyards of Belfast. She was called the Titanic, and from the moment her keel was laid, she was celebrated as the largest and most luxurious vessel the world had ever seen. At 882 feet long, she stretched nearly the length of 3 city blocks. Her designers fitted her with watertight compartments and advanced safety features, systems they believed made her practically unsinkable. To the public, Titanic wasn't just a ship, she was a symbol of modernity, proof that human progress had finally tamed the sea. On April 10, 1912, Titanic left Southampton on her maiden voyage, bound for New York City. She carried more than 2,200 souls, wealthy families and famous names in first class, hopeful immigrants packed into steerage, and a crew trained to operate the largest passenger vessel afloat. For 4 days, her crossing was uneventful. Passengers dined in opulent rooms, strolled her promenades, and marveled at the scale of this floating palace. She was, for many, a dream made real. But just before midnight on April 14th, reality struck. Lookouts in the crow's nest spotted an iceberg looming out of the darkness. Warnings had already been sent earlier in the day about ice fields in the North Atlantic. But Titanic steamed ahead at near full speed. The helm was thrown hard to port, the engines reversed, but there wasn't enough time. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side, opening a series of punctures below the waterline. It was not one gash, as many once believed, but a succession of small tears across several compartments. The result was the same. Titanic was mortally wounded. Over the next 2.5 hours, panic and confusion spread as the crew tried to load lifeboats. Just as Robertson had described in his fictional story, Titanic carried far too few. Regulations at the time were outdated, requiring lifeboats for only a fraction of those on board. Out of more than 2,000 passengers and crew, there was room for barely half. Some boats left half empty in the chaos. Families were separated, and as the stern lifted higher into the night sky, hundreds were left clinging to the rails. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, Titanic slipped beneath the waves. More than 1,500 people perished in the freezing Atlantic. The news shocked the world, not only for the staggering loss of life, but for what it seemed to represent. The arrogance of believing mankind had mastered nature, only to be humbled by something as ancient and simple as ice. In the days that followed, as newspapers told the story and survivors gave testimony, a strange connection began to resurface. Readers dug up a little-known book written in 1898. They opened its pages and discovered the Titan, an unsinkable ship, 800 feet long, short on lifeboats, striking an iceberg in April and sinking in the North Atlantic. A ship that had never existed, and yet seemed to have already lived the Titanic's fate.
This episode brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Shifting a little money here, a little there, and hoping it all works out? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can get a better budgeter and potentially lower your insurance bill too. You tell Progressive what you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll help find you options within your budget. Try it today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
In the wake of the Titanic tragedy, readers searched for meaning. The loss of 1,500 lives in an age that prided itself on progress felt like a blow to the very idea of human achievement. Newspapers called it the unsinkable ship undone, a reminder that nature still had the upper hand. Amid the grief and confusion, people began noticing an obscure little book from 1898. Morgan Robertson's Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan, long forgotten on dusty shelves, suddenly became the focus of fascination. As word spread, comparisons poured in. The Titan and Titanic were described as nearly the same length, both hailed as the largest ships of their time. Both were considered unsinkable. Both carried far too few lifeboats. Both sailed in April across the North Atlantic. Both struck icebergs on their starboard side while traveling at high speeds. And both sank, taking huge numbers of passengers with them. The resemblances were so precise that the book was reissued under a new title, The Wreck of the Titan, with marketing that leaned heavily into the eerie parallels. What had been dismissed as a melodramatic sea tale was now presented as prophecy. To the public, Robertson became something of a reluctant seer. Was he a prophet? Did he somehow glimpse the future? Reporters pressed him for answers, eager to frame the story as more than coincidence. But Robertson resisted the label. His reply was short and firm. No. I know what I'm writing about, that's all. He explained that his years as a merchant seaman had given him insight into the growing trends of shipbuilding. Vessels were getting larger and faster, and companies were cutting corners on safety in favor of luxury. To him, it didn't take prophecy to imagine disaster. It was an inevitability waiting to happen. Still, Robertson's denial did little to quiet the fascination. Readers wanted to believe there was something uncanny about his work, something beyond chance. The fact that Futility predated the Titanic by 14 years gave the story an almost supernatural aura, and the strangeness didn't stop with the Titan. In other works, Robertson described naval battles fought with periscopes and torpedoes launched from beneath the waves, ideas that became reality years later with the rise of submarine warfare in the First World War. Whether by foresight, intuition, or coincidence, his imagination seemed to anticipate the future more than once. Over time, the Titan-Titanic connection became inseparable from the legend of the Titanic itself. Every anniversary, every retelling of the disaster, every documentary or film seemed to return to Robertson's little book. It lingered not just because of the similarities, but because it captured the tension between pride and vulnerability. Both ships, real and imagined, represented the height of human achievement. Both were brought low by ice. Robertson may have denied any prophetic ability, but his story still felt like a warning delivered in advance. A warning the world only recognized too late. What unsettles me most about the Titan story isn't just the similarities to the Titanic, it's what those similarities force us to confront. I've said before that ghost stories, hauntings, even dark folklore don't really scare me. They fascinate me, but they don't get under my skin the way strange coincidences do. Because coincidences make you question whether the world is really as random as we like to believe. They peel back the curtain just enough to suggest that there may be patterns woven into our lives, patterns we can't always see until it's too late. Think about the Titan and the Titanic. One was born in the imagination of a writer in 1898. The other was built in steel and rivets in 1912. They shouldn't have anything in common. One is fiction, the other history. Yet when you line them up side by side, the connections are staggering. The length, the speed, the description of being unsinkable, the lack of lifeboats, the voyage in April, the collision with an iceberg in the North Atlantic, the catastrophic loss of life. Even the names Titan and Titanic carry the same weight, both drawn from mythology to convey grandeur and power. It's not just one or two similarities, it's a whole list that seems impossible to explain away as chance. And that's where the discomfort sets in. When we see patterns like this, our brains search for meaning. Some people lean toward the supernatural. Maybe Robertson really was tapping into something beyond imagination. Others suggest he was a prophet without knowing it. Skeptics counter that he was simply a skilled observer, drawing from maritime trends of his time and projecting what might happen. After all, ships were getting larger and faster, safety was being sacrificed for luxury, and icebergs were a well-known danger in the North Atlantic. In that sense, the tragedy of the Titanic may have been predictable, even if the exact details weren't. But whether you see it as prophecy or probability, the coincidence refuses to let go. More than a century later, we still bring up the Titan whenever the Titanic is discussed. It has become part of the larger story, a shadow that haunts the real tragedy. Because coincidences, especially ones this sharp, remind us that maybe the future isn't as open-ended as we like to think. Maybe sometimes it's written down long before we arrive at it, waiting for us to catch up. That, for me, is the part that lingers. Ghosts can be dismissed as imagination. Folklore can be explained as cultural storytelling. But coincidences, real, documented, undeniable, force us to wrestle with the possibility that chance isn't always chance. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The Titan and the Titanic will always mirror one another, one a story, one a reality, bound together by a coincidence that feels almost too perfect and far too unsettling to ignore. That brings us to the end of episode 9 of The Dark Record. We've traced a line from fiction to reality, from a forgotten sea tale to the most infamous maritime disaster of the 20th century. A ship that never existed seemed to foreshadow one that did, remembered, retold, and now added to the record. Next time, we'll step into a story that is as unsettling as it is tragic. The lives of June and Jennifer Gibbons, better known as the Silent Twins. Until then, I'm Lyle Perez, and this has been the Halloween Podcast, presenting The Dark Record. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It helps more than you know. You can also keep up with the show and join the conversation on Facebook at facebook.com/The Halloween Podcast, or explore extras online at thehalloweenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening. Stay curious, and remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or fate, but the coincidences we can't explain away. Have a good night.